his eyes, slowly rising. Sunrise warms the horizon.
With us now is Arda Barut, a communication director at Sweatshop, here to talk to us about something that's, I think, quite important for a lot of people, which is the Western Sydney literacy movement.
Hello everybody. So my name's Arda. I'm the communications director for Sweatshop, and I'm really happy to be here today.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm particularly excited to have you on the show today because I feel like with the past few weeks, with Western Sydney politicians actually, coming in to our area and suddenly deciding that, they need to fix this and that about, Western Sydney, they're sort of overlooking the fact that the actual people of Western Sydney have been working tirelessly behind the scenes to make this sort of difference. And Arda, you're one of those people. The Sweatshop is not your first initiative, but it is the newest initiative. So tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so what Sweatshop is a organisation that plans to... what I'll do first is actually talk about the philosophy of Sweatshop, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what we do. So what we plan to do with this organisation is make sure the people of Western Sydney have a right to self-determination. And what that means is making sure that our voices in Western Sydney are heard. And that's something that has to come from the people of Western Sydney themselves, not because someone lets us speak, or not because the Prime Minister comes here and gives us a platform to speak. Our solutions of our problems can't be handed to us. True freedom is about actually finding our own solutions to our own problems. And who better to know the problems and the solutions to Western Sydney's problems than the people of Western Sydney themselves.
Absolutely.
Well said.
So the second initiative of Sweatshop is that we aim to create social change through literacy. And historically social movements come about as a result of literacy. The greatest social movements have all been about literacy. So think of Malcolm X, for example. He taught himself to read and write in a prison cell, and he had a massive influence on the civil rights movement in America. The Quran is considered a miracle in our religion, and translation. Anyone who's read the Quran in the language of the Quran will tell you that translations just aren't the same. You need to know the language to understand the holy book properly, which is why literacy is so important. Like the point I'm trying to make is that literacy shapes the way we think about things and the way we see the world, which is why that's one of the main focuses of what Sweatshop does.
Okay, so why do you think this is particularly needed in Western Sydney, just with reference to your point about literacy actually changing the world?
To answer your question, I'll probably have to talk a little bit about Western Sydney itself. So first of all, let's not kid ourselves here. Western Sydney is one of the most disadvantaged areas in all of Australia. We've got higher proportions of low-income households. We have more one-parent families than anywhere else, more unemployed, more refugees than the rest of Sydney. Transport services are worse in Western Sydney than anywhere else. Low literacy levels in education, and an education system that doesn't take into account the diverse backgrounds of the students that inhabit this area. Let's look at the facts also, right? Western Sydney is a densely populated area. There are 1.6 million people living in this area.
Oh, wow. Didn't actually know that.
That's a third, yeah. So that's a third of Sydney's population. It's enormous, So whenever we hear a stereotype about Western Sydney from the media, immediately we need to be very skeptical because, with media representations of ethnic gangs, car-loving hoons, mall rats, teenage mothers, and not to mention, this general belief that the Western suburbs youth are more prone to low literacy levels and ADD and crime. Yeah. It's a pretty big stereotype and a very unhelpful one to make about 1/3 of Sydney's population.
And when you say unhelpful, are you referring to, the general perceptions of Western Sydney, or even, I feel like sometimes it plays on the psyche of the people of Western Sydney, because you have this sort of victimised attitude when you've got that sort of statistic speaking out so loudly.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's what I was trying to get at earlier. It's about actually recognising that we need to do this ourselves. We need to find our own solutions to our own problems. It's about self-determination.
What do you think the rhetoric being used by politicians and the outreach program that Julia Gillard visiting Sydney has been made out to be? It seems like she's condescended to travel all the way to Western Sydney to meet with the good old folk of Western Sydney. made to sound like we're, you know, hours and hours away from the city. We're not that far away. What do you think that sort of discourse is doing to people in Western Sydney?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree, but I think we should disassociate Julia Gillard from how the media represents Julia Gillard. And, you know, like in a very similar way to the way the Prime Minister is represented in the media, Western Sydney is represented in that very same way.
Fair enough.
So I think the point that I'd like to make, in fact, as far as I know, Julia Gillard has come to Western Sydney on a regular basis over her career. So you know, the only thing that's special about this visit is that all of a sudden Western Sydney now has a lot of contested seats, which are really important to winning the election, which is why there's so much attention to it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to push the Prime Minister. You know, I'm voting for the WikiLeaks party, so like I don't favour either.
Not the shooters.
Not the shooters, no. But yeah, so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, in terms of what Gillard has done for education in Western Sydney, she's built a whole lot of infrastructure. But yeah, we need to do a lot more. And coming back to your point, I think, yeah, again, democracy is about voice, you know, and there's a very big deficiency of voice when it comes to representing the extremely diverse population of Western Sydney. You know, like unfortunately our politics has become little less than a popularity contest when it should actually be about providing a platform where people can voice themselves as much as possible. So, and that's what we're trying to get at with Sweatshop.
So, with that in mind, what are the sort of initiatives or what approach is being taken by Sweatshop to sort of bring literacy to the forefront in Western Sydney and make people aware of just how important this issue is?
Okay, so I'll talk about what we're actually currently doing, and just to remind everyone, we're a very, very new organisation. So, firstly, we're currently holding a show in Melbourne called Sweatshop Stories, which focuses on personal hardship in Western Sydney. This is something that we're workshopping with a range of ethnically diverse writers who meet up at UWS regularly. And it's all about actually properly reflecting the voice of Western Sydney and getting that voice out there to the communities or to the rest of Australia. Another thing that we're doing is we're doing a Youth Week writing competition with Bankstown City Council, where we source a whole range of different writers, and the winners of that competition will be announced on the 11th of April, if memory serves me correctly. And we're also holding a Parramatta Youth Racism Forum in May, where we get students from Parramatta and the Parramatta LGA to discuss issues concerning racism, which is also very dear to our hearts.
So just to the first item you mentioned there, why, if it's about Western Sydney, are you holding that in Melbourne?
Because I think an important way of dealing with racism is actually making contact with the people who don't have contact with us, right? So if we're going to actually challenge these stereotypes, we need to go over to the places where people haven't been to Western Sydney, or, you know, only see the terrible images of what Western Sydney is in the media. So this is about actually going into, in Melbourne, going into those communities and saying, hey, look, this is the voice of Western Sydney. You know, this is what it's really like.
I think that's a great point, because obviously, you know, if you're in Western Sydney, you know that the stereotypes are just that, stereotypes. And you know that what's being represented in the media is not correct. So I think that's a really interesting idea, to take it to places that people don't have access to the voices of people in Western Sydney and say, hang on, guys, we actually know what we're doing, and we're actively involved in the community.
Absolutely. You know, if you really want to deal with the racist views, which are, you know, amplified by the way the media reports about it, you need to build that contact with people who hold those views. And it's really interesting. I was listening to you earlier talking about overt forms of racism on My Kitchen Rules, and you know, and it's absolutely inexcusable to have overt racist views, but on the other hand, I think to a certain level, at least you know that someone holds a racist view. You know, at least it's out in the open, so you can challenge it. You know, yeah. I'll tell you a little story of my own. You know, we're talking about stories and voices
Sure.
here.
Yeah.
But so you know, I'm of Turkish background, and you know, I grew up as a Turk in Auburn for most of my life. And I never felt Australian, you know, like I always rejected the concept of being Australian, because, you know, I thought it was about mateship and being into my sports, you know, I always rejected those notions. But what I've realised just recently is that, you know, I'm an Australian citizen, so why shouldn't my view of what it means to be Australian be any less than anyone else? You know, like it doesn't matter if you're the Prime Minister of Australia or if you're a refugee who just got your citizenship. Everyone's view on what it means to be Australian is equal. And so, yeah, like that's my own story. It's about actually owning the term Australian, you know, and saying I'm an Australian. And you know, to a lot of your listeners out there, you know, if you come from you know, a religiously conservative family, you know, if you're wearing hijab or whatever, you need to recognise that actually that's what it means to be Australian. You know, like, and you should be proud of that fact.
I think that's a very interesting point to dwell on, because I think Western Sydney in itself has always been, to me, such a hub of multiculturalism. But beneath, you know, the great food stores and the colourful clothing, there's this struggle of, you know, what does it mean to be Australian? And like you said, it's just about owning it, but I think it takes a long time to actually come around to that realisation. And I mean, I remember you mentioning the writing competition that's happening for Youth Week. Actually, one of the first ways that I sort of went into the literary scene in the Western Sydney area was by participating in one of the Bankstown Council Youth Weeks. And I remember another member of Sweatshop, Muhammad Ahmed, was actually one of the judges at the time, and he eventually became my mentor. And I'd submitted a story that was just completely abstract, you know, it didn't really have any ties to any location or suburb or even a topic, I don't think. And he just sort of said to me, well, why didn't you write something about Bankstown? Isn't that where you're from? You know, write something about a bus stop in Bankstown. You're here all the time, you know, catching buses and trains and whatnot, and such a hub of, you know, the heart of Western Sydney sort of thing. And I thought it was a bit strange at the time, but when I sort of sat and thought about it, I was like, well, I am from Western Sydney. Why not write about what I know, and why not actually present that view to the rest of Sydney and the rest of Australia who, like you mentioned before, only really see those stereotypes. So I totally agree with you on that point, and I think it's a good thing that Sweatshop's sort of really working to bring that out.
I really like that point, because it works on two levels. It works on the level that you've just mentioned, Miran, which is other people realising that people in Western Sydney have a voice. But what you've just mentioned about the struggle that people have with identity and culture, I think it's important, as you've mentioned, for people in Western Sydney to realise that they're entitled to voice their opinion. It's not just a matter of it being embraced by other people. Whether or not it's embraced is a separate issue. I think it's quite important for people in Western Sydney to say, hang on, what it means to be Australian, that depends on what I think being Australian actually means, and that's going to affect what the Australian identity is seen as on a global scale.
Absolutely. You know, it's a civic duty. It's a civic duty to actually go out and say, this is what it means to be Australian, and this is where I come from, and this is who I am.
Absolutely.
So yeah, like,
Okay,
absolutely right.
So what's next with Sweatshop?
Well, you know, we're in a very kind of embryonic stage at the moment, but I feel like this is an area that you know, there's a really big need and a really big desire for an organisation like this. That, you know, it's a movement of literacy. It's a movement that that enables people from Western Sydney, from ethnically diverse and disadvantaged backgrounds, to you know, to voice who they are, and to voice what it means to be Australian. So in terms of what's next for Westside, I think we're going to continue to do projects like this, and I think Western Sydney is waking up to this. You know, I think we're beginning to understand that you know, we need organisations like this that goes into communities, that sources writing, that gets their voice out there, and yeah. So I've got big hopes for us in our future.
And so if somebody does want to participate and become a part of this movement, how would they go about doing that?
Well, the best thing that you can do at the moment is probably follow us on Twitter, or just type in Sweatshop in Facebook, where you can find us. We've got our Facebook page up there. So yeah, that's going to be, like, at the moment, our hub of networking. So you'll see everything that we're doing and how we're doing it on there.
Okay, and your Twitter handle was at sweatshop_WS?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you very, very much for joining us on the show today, Arda.
It's been really interesting, and hopefully our listeners can take something away from it and realise that they are empowered to actually do something about the way they're viewed and their contribution to the community. So yes, as Miran said, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.